What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the In Faith Podcast. My name is David. As always, I'm joined by Steve.
Glad to be here.
And Steve, we're going through this series. We're still in this series, Men of the Bible, still talking about Moses. But interestingly enough, we're at this point in Moses' story where the consequences are starting to take place. Even though when God was talking to Moses and telling him, kind of guiding him and giving him that direction to go and confront Pharaoh, and he was worried that nobody would listen. Well, it turns out, God gives him these three signs that if no one listens, he'll perform these three miracles and that'll grab their attention. But what it doesn't grab is the attention of Pharaoh.
Right. The signs that he gave did get the Israelites to believe.
Right.
To believe that Moses had spoken to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who is I am. But they didn't. Pharaoh was not convinced by the staff turning into a snake.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember for sure. Did he do the leprous hand in front of Pharaoh? I don't remember seeing that, but the magicians were able to make their staffs turn into snakes as well, even though Aaron's staff ate the magicians. It wasn't enough. And clearly, as we go on, Pharaoh, it isn't enough for Pharaoh way past where it would be enough for probably all of us, everyone listening. Certainly for me. I think even the magicians, as we see, Pharaoh keeps pushing, no, I can't do this. No, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, earlier on one of our previous episodes where we talked about the results of Moses and Aaron going in front of Pharaoh to begin with, and saying, hey, you need to let our people go and worship God. 3 days journey, we need to sacrifice to our God. And Pharaoh is like, oh, do you have time to go wandering around and sacrificing to God and everything? You must not be busy enough. And because they had asked for that time, Pharaoh then said, all right, guess what? The Israelites aren't going to get any straw anymore. They have to get their own straw.
Right.
And they're going to have to make just as many bricks as they did before, even though they have to take a bunch of time getting their own straw, which clearly they couldn't do. So now, Pharaoh, being the tyrant leader that he is, he did figure out exactly how to turn their own people against Moses and Aaron. Because the next time when they saw the people coming out from talking to Pharaoh saying, hey, you got to give us a break. What is this change? Why are you doing this? And Pharaoh's like, well, hey, Moses and Aaron representing you came in and said that you needed to go out and worship the Lord. Clearly you're not busy enough. So, talk to Moses and Aaron if you're upset about this new rule. And basically they did. And they were angry with Moses and Aaron, and we looked at the idea that God can call us to do things that will create anger within the very body of Christ.
Right.
Others that don't have the full vision of what God has called you to do could get angry because there will be conflict before God shows his glory in the middle of things.
Well, and it still kind of mind boggles me to this day because, reading that he was only asking for 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're thinking about it from like a productivity state of mind, it's like, okay, these guys were probably working every day, all day, 3 days, go worship, come back, keep working, whatever the case may be. there wasn't too much to go off of what would happen after those 3 days. I mean, we did see that God did say that He will let His people go. So we
Right.
know eventually that was the plan, was to free the
But
Israelites.
I think part of God, yes, it's God's plan to free the Israelites, but that's knowing who Pharaoh is. Pharaoh is not someone who's going to be decent to the Israelites.
Hmm.
And
No.
God knows that. And so he can't get so God's not going to be able to just say be like a union
Hmm.
and negotiate good working terms
No.
for his people. Um, so he knew he was going to bring them out. However, God's grace actually showed Pharaoh to start with, look, all I'm asking for is 3 days into the wilderness. And they need that time to sacrifice to me, to worship me, to get filled up, and then come back. And you're thinking about productivity. The trouble is there. So, Pharaoh's in I got to get my pyramid built um, so that I'll have, a legacy after this. And, it's going to take 50 years. I can't spare 3 days. We got to make sure this thing gets built.
Hmm.
There's no, because God's saying all of them at one time. Not, I'm going to take a third of them during this 8-hour shift and the next third during the next shift.
All
And,
right.
you can go back and forth and keep some activity going. No, you have to shut it down. You have
Everybody.
to close it down. I mean, and how many companies today, if everyone came to the boss and said, you know what, God has called all of us to go out and worship him for 3 days. We got to shut this company down. How many bosses are going to take kindly to their employees saying, we need to go worship for 3, all of us down to the last man. You're going to have to shut down.
Oh, I think I don't know. I'm sure a lot of them would be, kind of upset or really resistant to to going for it. But I mean, we're at a time today where I can look back 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Well, I guess it was more than that, back in 2020. So what, 5 years ago when we went through COVID and the whole world shut down for anywhere from 3 to 9 months, if not longer.
Well,
So 3 days, a year or two.
but why? It's more important to think of why did the world shut down?
Oh yeah,
The world shut down for fear,
oh yeah. Well, that was a whole different case than what is being done here.
right?
I'm
And
just thinking of the comparison to
Right.
do you want to give 3 days by choice or do you want to give longer by force?
I see, yeah. And so it was hopeful in 2020, as I remember that first piece, because the announcement was just shut down for, I don't remember, was it a month, 30 days, something like that?
I think
Um,
it started with like 14 days or something.
Yeah, because they're hopeful that this whole thing will pass over and come back. So you're right. The first of that was just a hopeful thing. If we shut down, if everybody shuts down for 14 days, then everybody back to work and we've only lost 14 days. But of course, that had no effect. And it wasn't just a 14-day deal and things went on, but it was all fear to start with.
Right.
It wasn't any part of, you know what, we don't have control here. We don't have control over this disease. And nothing we can do is going to give us control over this disease. We've got to trust that God is making a way for us through this. It doesn't mean be stupid.
Right. But I mean, I compare that to the fear that, led to the shutdown, to what Pharaoh here is being warned about. And that didn't strike fear. And I think the reason that didn't strike a lot of fear was because of the fact that Pharaoh had these, magicians that were performing or imitating the same signs that Moses and Aaron were. But we even see, even with the staff and the snake, that Aaron's staff swallowed up the magician's staff. So there was a comparison of strength and reality there,
Hmm.
and nothing was going to overpower what God had, or anointed them with.
Yeah.
But because of that, I mean, he was forewarned. He was warned that these plagues were going to come. Moses was warned that Pharaoh wasn't going to listen, and it was blatantly told that um, Pharaoh's heart was going to be hardened. So
Yeah.
God did. God hardened Pharaoh's heart in response to his stubbornness, and then now it was time for the first out of 10 plagues. So in the first plague, we read that it was the Nile that turned to blood. And that's good. We're going to see in chapter, what is it, Exodus 7:14-25. The Lord told Moses to have a personal confrontation with Pharaoh down by the riverside. And when he went out to the water, Moses was warned that, Moses was to warn the king that the fish would die and the river would stink and become loathsome to the Egyptians after it was turned to blood by the rod in Moses' hand. Plus, you got all these fish in the Nile that just die and rot, and now you got a whole river that just is horrid.
Well, and the Nile is, so to say, the lifeblood of Egypt. Without that river running through Egypt, they're in a desert.
Mm-hmm.
That river is what allows them to have, the city that they have there, to have people living together, to have, something to eat and a water supply and everything else. So the very first thing God is showing him is that your very ability to live depends on me.
Right.
It's not some other God protecting the Nile. It's not the Nile as a God itself. It's me. I'm the God who's over all creation.
Right.
And that's not a belief that the Egyptians had, but he's showing the power that he has over what they need for life.
Oh, definitely. And to understand the significance to the river turning to blood and the fish dying, we have to understand the importance to that river to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So the fish, that's their food supply, right? Or a pretty good chunk of it. And then the water supply that runs through there, well, like you said, without that, they couldn't they couldn't inhabit that area. It would be nothing but desert, no water. In verses 19-25, Moses and Aaron did exactly what God had commanded them. They stretched out the rod over the waters of Egypt, and the water of the Nile and the land of Egypt were turned into blood. The fish died, and the river began to stink. The river, the scent of the blood and the dead fish, I could only imagine. It was just terrible, but that's what they said would happen.
I find it interesting here that they talk about even like barrels where they had standing water, where they had stored water, turned to blood also.
It was all of it.
Yeah, everything. I mean, they didn't have running water, but for us, our toilets would
Right.
it was
everything
in your house also turned to blood.
So any water came from the Nile turned to blood.
Yeah.
No matter its location.
Yeah.
If it was the Nile River water, it was turned to blood.
Right.
Funny thing is, the magicians that we see, try to duplicate and match Moses and Aaron before, did it again.
Yeah.
They duplicated the miracle with water, but they did it with water found elsewhere other than the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure they probably did it to encourage Pharaoh to resist Moses' demands and or the demands to let the people go. And during the 7 days when the Nile was polluted, the people obtained water by digging wells. So,
it's interesting there is what it says. My version anyway. and the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, but they could not drink the water of the Nile. So I guess God did give grace here again. He allowed some water, drinkable water, to come up. It
To the
doesn't,
people.
yeah, it doesn't
No.
expressly say that.
No, but if you think about it, and this is just my mind running wild, if you think about it, Pharaoh's not going to go dig his own well.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh's people are probably too busy trying to find a way around this rather than going to the source. Now, this whole, if I was to try and understand this, and paint that picture, God's hardening Pharaoh's heart and those who are allied with him, I guess, or on his staff. But I don't see him punishing the people. Now he's doing this to all of Egypt, but for his people, he did give mercy, and he is okay. Well, there is some drinkable water here. You can't get it from this river, but if you dig alongside of it and you hit water, that water's drinkable.
He does, though, punish the people of Egypt in these plagues. His own people, the Israelites, yes. He shows a separation there. Like you're saying here with this first plague, it looks like, yes, God gave some grace here, that the well that they're able to dig alongside the river apparently did not come up blood as they were looking for drinking water. It doesn't specifically say they were successful, but it does say that they were digging along the Nile for water to drink because they couldn't drink the water of the Nile.
Right.
But as we go on, we see, the Egyptian people are punished. The people, not just Pharaoh. And really, God hasn't had to harden Pharaoh's heart yet. I mean, he will. And it'll specifically tell us that. And God, like you mentioned, God has said he will harden Pharaoh's heart. But right now, Pharaoh's easily hardening his own heart.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
As soon as the musicians
himself
are able to make some water turn to blood, he's like, whoop, that's it. This is just a trick. I'm not listening to this. I need you making bricks. You got to build my pyramid. So I think of the only, kind of like what you were mentioning, Pharaoh's the one that it's bad government, yet the people are complicit in this. The people of Egypt are benefiting from the Israelites being slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And they essentially like the way it's set up. Maybe not fully like it, but they are benefiting from it, and they're not doing anything about it. It's highly different, but you think about the Holocaust in Germany, where there were people in Germany trying to say, well, we didn't really know. But I remember seeing documentaries when the Allies discovered those concentration camps and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They took the people that lived in towns right next to them and made those people go through the concentration camps. Because there's no way that you could live right next to it and not know that something evil is going on. So the idea that you can be in the midst of a system like this and be fully innocent of that system, it seems to be that God is saying no. It's not just Pharaoh and how he's ruling. It's the people that are complicit with this whole system.
Okay, yeah. So that's understandable. That makes more sense. That's a good example on why you don't jump ahead with assumptions before moving ahead into the reading. So
it's hard to deal with too, because we live in a democracy, right?
Right.
So we feel like, yes, we're involved in our government and stuff, but if there's a dictator ruling over people, how much are they responsible for the way things are?
Very true.
And here it seems like God is saying, well, they still are. They do have responsibility. They're okay with how things are. They're benefiting with how things are. um, and there's punishment that comes out to the people as well. So it's a hard thing. I think we as Christians can never be complicit. We can never be, I don't know, lethargic and okay about wrong activities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and luckily we still see that in our country. We still see protests against, essentially using minor slave labor type people to to assemble shoes on 12-hour shifts or anything like that in other countries. I don't know how much of that has been fully true and how much of that still goes on or anything like that. But we do at least still live in a country where people, some of the things that we think of as being wrong now, maybe a little off, but there are still things that our society won't accept
Mm-hmm.
as being okay, so that it gets spoken out against and such.
Yeah. Well, and it does seem, I mean, we don't get a lot of info on the reading, but it does seem like, if God had to send Moses and Aaron, we know why Aaron got sent, because Moses was coming up with every excuse in the book. But to have Moses go back in to Egypt and settle this away, I mean, I can only imagine. Yeah, the people there probably got complacent with the way things were.
Yeah.
Not that they agreed with it or enjoyed it, but they probably thought, well, this is the way it is, and there's no point in fighting it. But we don't really see a lot of people turning to God in that situation, in that whole ordeal. Because even when, like you were saying before, like we were talking about how the people, once Pharaoh took away the help and said, well, you got to go fetch your own material
Mhm.
now, and he said, if you don't like it, go take it up with Moses and Aaron, who say they come representing you. They did. They went to Moses and Aaron. They're like, what the heck, man? You just made it harder for us, when
Yeah.
prior to that they were listening to what Moses was saying, and they were kind of jumping on board and being like, oh
Right.
man, this is so great. God's finally come to save us. And then right after, it's like, what are you doing here, man? You're making it worse for us.
So I just had a thought. You were talking about in 2020 and COVID shutting things down and all that. Even though the government was demanding churches not to meet, there were churches that continued
Oh yeah.
to meet during that time. There were other churches that were upset that the church would go against government and continue to meet that way, and thought that that was going to make it harder and worse on all churches because they were doing that.
Well, and it was crazy. And I know probably know where I'm going with this, but it was crazy. You and I were both doing some ministry, and we kept going.
Yeah.
Everybody was serving. We kept we did everything we could to stay, safe, and to stay alongside of ordinances and things like that. But you would get people that would call the police because there was a gathering taking place. And when we would serve the food boxes, we wouldn't go outside and hand deliver them. We'd open the window and kind of keep the distance there. But cops would show up on quite a few occasions, I remember. And I won't say any names to put any cities or anything out there. But I mean, cops showed up, and it was amazing that they looked around, looked at what we were doing, and said, you know what? We refuse to shut down the church. And they
Yeah.
thanked us, and we thanked them, and they went on their way. We went on ours and did what we had to do, what we were called to do. And then we went home.
Yeah.
But it was incredible to see that power of God's will. If it wasn't something we were supposed to be doing, it would have gotten shut down.
Mm-hmm.
I believe. But because, that was one of the things that God had orchestrated and called us to do, he laid that blanket over it and wouldn't allow it to be shut down per se. And then you got churches, yeah, a lot of them shut down, but a lot of them kept going even after being forced to close the doors. They found other ways, other means, other um, directions, such as online, to get the word out. At least, it was a hard time. It was a hard time for everybody in every different culture as well.
Yeah.
That COVID, man.
Well, I think, churches continued to stay open because they looked at Hebrews chapter 10. I'll start at 23, where it says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." So that verse, and Paul also has a verse, one of his letters, talking about make sure that we're meeting together to encourage each other, to be in the midst of praise for God and the encouragement that it gives. And really, during COVID, what did we end up seeing? We saw a spike. We saw a lot more depression come on from people who lived alone and didn't have a lot of contact and stuff. God has said the more important thing is to make sure you're meeting together. Yes, there's diseases, and we got to be smart about how we handle things. But we need to check the Word of God when we're considering how to handle things also.
Exactly, because you do have those scriptures that, those in positions of power have been, placed that we need to pray for,
Mm-hmm.
because they've been placed in that position, by God, even if they're not following it to the T. And that's one thing I've had to learn, read and kind of look more into, because I'm like, well, how could somebody who's not even following your will be placed in that position by you, Lord? But what came to me simply is free will. God can place any one of us in any kind of situation or position. It's what we do with it that's going to matter.
Yeah.
Are we going to turn to him and follow his will, or are we going to go off and do our own free will? And, there's consequences to every action, such as this one with Pharaoh.
Yeah.
We've gone through the first plague out of 10 plagues. Turning the Nile red and killing the fish was just one.
Which is enough for me, by the way.
It is.
I'm convinced.
That's ruining your whole food supply.
Yeah.
You're the majority of your food supply. It's ruining all of your water supply, except for like what we talked about, the little bit that he gave grace in. But then they get hit with the second plague.
I just quickly, like you mentioned, the Nile and how able to put staff in the Nile and it turns to blood. Everything kills the fish. It's blood. I mean, it's not like it's just red.
Right. Oh, yeah.
This
that's
is
what
an enormous amount of blood. An entire river.
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge. That's a lot of blood.
He didn't just put food coloring in there and turn it red.
And it made me think, though. So when Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee, and it gets super rough, right? These are fishermen, but the storm is so bad that they're afraid this whole ship is going to boat, it's not a giant thing. It's a boat, is going to get torn apart. They're not even going to make it across the sea here. It's going to get torn apart tonight. And they go down where Jesus is sleeping. And they say, "Lord, don't you care? We're about to die. This boat is going to be ripped apart by the waves. And you're sleeping."
Yeah.
And, Jesus stands up and he tells the lake to be still. and everything stops. All the waves stop. All the storm stops. And the thought that the disciples have at that time is, what sort of man is this who has command over nature in that way? It feels like that was a giant turning point for the disciples to say, this is no mere man. Man cannot have control over nature that way. Yet we're looking at the Nile. How did the people of Egypt not have the same reaction as the disciples?
Well, I'll tell you why. And this is my understanding. It's because they had these two buffoon magicians doing the same exact thing in alternative ways. So when you've got somebody that is doing the work that God anointed them to do, and then you've got these two knuckleheads over here saying, "Oh yeah, we can do it too. It's nothing but a mere trick." And then they go and do it too. Then it not only does that cause a bunch of confusion, it causes so much doubt too. And that's why Pharaoh's probably just sitting back laughing at this whole thing and saying, "Oh yeah, my guys can do it too. It's nothing but a mere trick. Try again." And it continues to happen because and I don't know if it's because they continue to taunt it, but just like, the people then had that reaction saying, this is no mere man can control all this. They're going to get the same reaction eventually too. There's going to come a point where God overdoes them. God outdoes them, and they say, "Look, we can't replicate that one." And we'll get to it here eventually, but I mean, it just takes a little longer for these guys because they're so full of their own head tricks that they're these like magicians, or I mean, that's what this calls them, magicians. I'm like so reluctant to call them anything outside of foolish, but they're duplicating, they're replicating these things that Moses and Aaron are doing and saying, "Oh, it's nothing but a mere trick because we can do it too." But then
isn't the point though to this? Okay, so you're showing me that you can change water into blood also, but that doesn't really matter. What you haven't shown me is that you're able to keep what Moses is doing from harming us. He just killed all the fish in the Nile. How long before their food supply gets fixed when all the fish in the Nile are currently dead?
Right.
How long before their water supply is clean when it's all blood right now?
Well, and I don't think they're thinking about it. I don't think he's really thinking about it, because when we go on to the second plague, which was frogs, that seemed to be the only one that at least the first one that kind of shook him up. We don't see much about the river in Pharaoh's reaction, but we do see it in the second plague when the frogs came. So the plague of frogs covered the land of Egypt and was distressing. It was so distressing that Pharaoh seemed to relent on that one. So when he asked Moses to have the plague lifted, Moses said, "Accept the honor of saying, when I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your houses, that they may remain in the river only." So that was kind of the first time we see Pharaoh get kind of shaken up there. And I don't know why. I don't know why with the water and the fish didn't seem like that big of a deal. I think he was still. Have you ever had that kind of doubt or hesitation to where you want to believe the first thing that sounds convincing, even though deep down it's not true, but you want to force yourself to believe the convincing thing because it's more appeasing or appealing to the what you're going through? I think that's what he's doing here, and that's kind of what it reminds me of. This here was Pharaoh's looking to these magicians, and he's like, "Oh, well, is this a trick? Can you replicate that one? Oh, you can? Okay, well, this might not be that serious because my guys can do it too." But we read after the frogs, the magicians were able to produce frogs as well.
Yeah.
As if there weren't, enough already from, what God had done. But these magicians were able to duplicate this one as well. And they, in some commentaries it states that they probably did it by demonic power. You and I were talking about this before we went live on the episode. Was how 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 could they have possibly been able to even do that much? And because they're calling them magicians, I'm like, it's got to be all smoke and mirrors, right? And it's like, well, they were kind of, with the way you explained it, where they were kind of summoning, demonic powers to do this. And what better way for an enemy to attack than your own free will? Make it sound, oh well, I'll give you the ability to do this. How cool would that be? Can it entice you with the gift of free will, I'll say.
Yeah, and it seems interesting in Scripture. It's clear that neither the devil nor his demons can, they can't create. They are not God. Only God can create. And only God truly has control over nature. But what we see the devil say offer Jesus when he's being tempted is false, but it looks good. And what say witches today, witches of all times, magicians, conjurers of different things, as they call on powers outside of God, they're calling for something that's not real, and it gets delivered at times. So the devil can offer things that look very good. That's what he does.
Oh yeah,
he offers things that look good.
And they look good, but they have no power behind it.
Right.
Which we were about to see here. They have no power behind it. So like we said, the magicians were able to duplicate the river. They were able to duplicate the frogs. And I kind of see, you had mentioned this as well, I kind of see a pattern here the more we're reading into it. Because after they were able to reproduce or replicate or duplicate the frogs, the plague of the frogs, they were dared not to destroy the frogs because the frog was worshipped as the god of fertility.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like God's taking all these things that were used as a something in place of him and completely overwhelming them with that same thing. It's like, well, you worshipped the Nile. Well, now that's blood and dead fish. You look to frogs for infertility. Now you have all the frogs you could ever imagine, and they're freaking out, except for I'm sure the magician. I don't even know, because I can imagine the magicians are like, oh yeah, we could do that, but we know we're kind of full of it, and we don't know how they're doing it, but this is how we're doing it. But the frogs died the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And when the frogs died, now think of this, not only are they getting the stench from the Nile, the blood in the water, when there's no blood in the water, it's just blood at that point. Dead fish, now they got the stench of dead frog as well. All these frogs, and you can imagine millions and millions of frogs just die the next day all at once. They're spread out everywhere. The stench of that probably was like just more than I can even come up with the words for. But once again, Pharaoh once again hardened his heart after that as well.
Yeah. I think also kind of what you and I looked at beforehand, the oddness of how Pharaoh deals with this. So again, the magicians, conjurers, they're able to get frogs to come up out of the river also. Mm-hmm. But they're not able to protect Egypt from frogs coming up out of the river. I mean, that's great that you can create the same thing, but who really cares? What we want you to do now is protect us. Send these frogs back. That's, really what Pharaoh should have been. Instead of saying, can you do this? Pharaoh should have been saying, can you send the frogs back to the river so we don't have these nasty things inside of our houses, inside of our pots where we're trying to cook, and Um, but that's not what they do. He, like you said, he's satisfied that the magicians can do this, so it's just a magician's trick. It's all going to blow over, and we'll get rid of these pesky people, and life will go on, and my pyramid will get built, and everything's going to be great.
Yeah. Well,
And yet, the other odd thing I looked at, where Moses literally asks him, "When do you want me to ask God to get rid of these frogs?" And Pharaoh says, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow. I'm sorry if I'm knee deep in frogs and there's frogs in every cranny of my house and jumping out of cereal boxes and nastiness like that. I'm saying get rid of the frogs
now.
right now." Moses, pray to God now. All right, just whoosh. But and like
Well,
you
hold on though, because even when he said tomorrow and then they got rid of them, they didn't get rid of them.
right, they just
They just
died. That's what
died.
I was about to say. So your hopes are that what he prays to get rid of the frogs, that they're all just going to go hop back down to the river and float away to another
No.
place. But God says, you have to deal with the consequences of nasty frogs everywhere. Now you have dead nasty frogs everywhere that you're going to have to go around and pick up and get rid of.
Well, do you think he said tomorrow because how much they looked to the frog for infertility? Do you think it's like, oh, don't kill them because they mean something to us when they mean absolutely nothing? They're part of God's creation, but they didn't symbolize
Yeah.
anything as far as the God of infertility, or not infertility, fertility. Sorry.
I wonder if it's not sort of an act on Pharaoh's part to just act like this doesn't bother us that much. So, just get rid of them by tomorrow. We're okay. It's a little nuisance.
Yeah.
Just kind of, take it by tomorrow. He doesn't want to fully say, you have gotten under my skin all the way. They have to go now.
Even though it was kind of a dead giveaway, though, because that was the one that he first confronted Moses with. He didn't, or at least we don't read that he said anything to Moses with the Nile. But then when the frogs came, he's like, hey. That's when, to me, that's when you can tell he's getting kind of worried.
Yeah.
But then you've got these two, mindless sorcerers or magicians or buffoons. We can do that too. But the third plague, I don't understand. I don't quite maybe I will after we read into it, but I don't quite understand. Okay, so first plague, Nile turns to blood, fish die. Second plague, frogs everywhere. They die. It reeks. Third plague, gnats. Now, if you think of gnats, Steve, it's like, when I was a kid, I played baseball all throughout my whole life. And for high school, back in middle school, in the off seasons, in the summer leagues, it was what I enjoyed doing, but I was always in that outfield.
Yeah.
And it would just drive me insane.
All over your ankles.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Especially at night.
Yeah.
Games, you would stand and you'd be out in your position in the outfield. I was usually always in right field. Every time I'd look up, there'd be a swarm of gnats flying above me. And it's just it's the environment. You're in the grass, you're sweating, they're attracted to it, the mosquitoes, the lights, it just everything kind of plays out for these gnats. And then what drove me nuts was they were all like right here. And if I moved, they would move with me. I moved back and they would move back. So when I see that this third plague was gnats, I'm like, okay, this one would definitely, oddly enough, drive me insane.
Yeah.
Because you don't know, they're so small, but if you, even if you ever had one like fly into your ear and you can hear that little drives me crazy. It drives me absolutely nuts. Now I would have gone crazy with the Nile.
Yeah.
I would have definitely went insane with the frogs everywhere. And then the gnats, I'd be like, this is too much.
And
you need to do something here.
To me, these have to be biting gnats too, like fleas that are on you.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about how bad fleas are. if you've got a pet and those fleas get in your carpet and you try to lay down on your carpet, you just get chewed up.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it'll drive you nuts, for the next hour you're scratching your head because you've had fleas on you,
Well,
and it just felt horrible.
and that's what I can imagine is when you're talking about a plague of gnats, you're not just talking about a swarm. I mean, you're talking every inch of this town is covered.
Yeah. Well-
I can imagine is just covered. A plague of gnats isn't just, I'm not thinking of just a little swarm that moves from place to place to place throughout the city. I'm thinking it is surrounding
Right.
and all in every square inch
Yep.
of this place.
Well, and you think, I mean, if they were unable to keep frogs out of their houses,
Oh yeah.
there's no way you can keep these gnats out of your house.
No, they're going everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And just the picture. I like the picture there where it says Aaron hits the ground and the dust that rises up turns into gnats.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, you can imagine the dust all over Egypt turning into gnats and
Yeah.
just flying everywhere. And what a mess that is. And that's, yeesh.
Yeah, we can read that in chapter 8, 16 through 19. How he just hits the ground and
Yeah.
the dust from the ground turns into all these gnats. But this is the first time we see even the magicians start to take it seriously.
Yeah.
Because now, after this time, after this third plague, after the gnats, they go to Pharaoh and they're like, "Hey, we're not able to produce gnats.
Mhm.
We can't do that." And they warned Pharaoh that a power greater than theirs was at work.
Yeah, the actual quote in mine in verse 19, chapter 8, verse 19 of Exodus says, "Then the magician said to Pharaoh, 'This is the finger of God.' But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said."
Yeah. Well, I like in this note, it kind of explains how you were phrasing it, how at that point Pharaoh was hardening his own heart.
Yeah.
It in this little note, it says the more he hardened his heart, meaning Pharaoh, the more it was hardened by God. So Pharaoh's stubbornness ultimately leads to it becoming more of a permanent solution. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's doing it to himself, but then as he's doing it, God's embedding it.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, well, you harden your heart again, even more. And the more he does it, the more God, okay. And we're going to try something more. We're going to give another one.
Yeah, and kind of like you and I had talked before, it seems like there would come a point in the middle of these plagues where even Pharaoh, with his hard heart and his stubbornness and his ego and everything that's going on, even he at one point would relent and just say, "I have nothing over the power of God who is doing these plagues. I am going to comply just so the plagues end." But God wanted to make sure these plagues did not end until he was fully done showing his power to the world. So God wanted to make sure all 10 plagues played out. So I think, yes, Pharaoh's hardening his own heart at first, but whenever he would be tempted to go ahead and say, "I need to cut my losses and let these people go out and worship their God and sacrifice,"
Well,
God's not going to let it happen until he's done.
yeah. Well, and he tries to do that after the fourth plague.
Yeah.
So after the flies come in, which is the fourth plague, he kind of caves under that pressure in 25 through 32. He kind of caves at that point to the extent of allowing the Israelites to sacrifice to God in the land of Egypt. But that just wouldn't do. God would not let it happen because they would be sacrificing animals worshipped by the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So that's when he's like, no, I'm not gonna, it's too late to go back. You're gonna go through all of this now, and then they'll be free. It's like
Yeah.
the more you hardened your heart, you can't, I just kind of picture it like the longer you hardened it, you can't go back one step and reverse all of these other steps that you took to
Well,
completely go the opposite way.
and he's not fully trying to reverse either.
No, he's saying
He's
to the
trying to
extent.
negotiate.
Yeah, there it
He's
is.
negotiating with God. He's like, well, how about you just do it within the land? You don't actually leave the land. You can do your worshiping and stuff within the land where I can still control you, where I can still have you surrounded, where I can make sure that you don't escape and go anywhere.
Right.
You know, and I'm afraid this is a warning for us as well. When
Oh, yeah,
God
that's to
calls us,
negotiate.
exactly, he calls us to do things. We're like, well, God, I know, I felt like you were calling me to, go do whatever. I can do that in my own household. So I don't need to go anywhere, but I'm spreading your word in my household and I'm doing that, which is something you should do also.
Right.
And should already be doing, and God's pushing you. So yeah, this negotiating with God. We saw Moses somewhat try it with all of his excuses.
Mm-hmm. Well, he still ended up going, though.
Yeah, he still ends up going, and God was showing all kinds of grace and mercy and answering him each time. But God finally got mad at Moses when he just kept pushing and kept pushing and kept pushing.
Well, and what I find funny is something, because you're bringing up, how it's kind of a warning to us as well, not to negotiate with God. Pharaoh tries to negotiate with, okay, I'll allow it. They can go into the wilderness to sacrifice, but they can't go far.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to work for God, because God called them to go on a 3 days journey.
Right.
Not go, 50 feet out and stay there for 3 days. It was a consistent 3-day journey. And here Pharaoh is saying you can't go far, but as soon as Egypt got a little bit of relief from the plagues, he changed his mind and forbid the people to go.
Right.
So it was that exact same mentality that I know I've found myself in quite a bit in the past, where it's like, okay, well, let me compromise with you, let me negotiate with you, let me give you something verbal that is good to hear, where it sounds good on paper, and then you get your way, and then you're like, oh well, about that, or you just go back to, I think of it as I'm a kid, when when I was a kid, I would always do, oh, I'll do better. Well, this time, this is how I'd come up with this whole thing, this whole game plan of what I'm going to do differently to not end up in trouble. And then the second that door opened down that path again, I did nothing
Mm-hmm.
to not go down that path again. And I see the same thing happening with Pharaoh here. It's okay. Just lift, give us relief. I'll let them go, but they can't go far, but give us a little bit of relief. Second, we get relief. No, it's forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes the 5th plague.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into fairly quickly if we can. If not, it's fine. We'll get through the 5th. We'll have to cut the 10 plagues into 2 5-parters, but that'll be okay. Give us something to really look into next week as well. But it's just amazing to me how each one of these plagues, although for a purpose, they have this significance to them that's really not only based off of like the culture that Egypt has adopted, but they all keep getting worse and worse and worse, because Pharaoh keeps getting worse and worse and worse. His heart keeps getting harder and harder and harder.
You think also, like you were saying, that they're attacking the culture. These plagues are attacking what the Egyptians worship
Mm-hmm.
and turning it against them. But now we're getting to a plague that is going to very directly. Now, turning the Nile into blood certainly hurt their economy. It hurt their fishing supply. It hurt their water. Yeah. They had to blow all kinds of money trying to dig wells and everything else. But now this next plague we're about to see very directly is going to hit their economy.
Well, yeah, because you think not just, you know, the livestock, because that's what the fifth plague is. It's going after the livestock.
Yeah.
Taking out the livestock takes out a bigger portion of the food supply, but it's also taking away the sacrificial, you know, the what they're doing with their own beliefs. Because that was a big reason why we read that when he first kind of conceded to letting them go um, uh, worship to the extent of allowing them to sacrifice to God in the land of Egypt, it wouldn't do because they were sacrificing animals that were worshipped by the Egyptians. So not only, you know, is it cutting off a good portion, the majority portion of a food supply, there's a point to be made here because of how much they idolized and worshipped these animals. They turned to, I mean, shoot, man, they turned to frogs for fertility. I'm sorry, but the last thing I want to think about when I think of fertility is a frog. I mean, if you're trying to create a family, the last thing I want to think about is or turn to is a frog to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean
I can't do it.
the beliefs that man can come up with are often well, heck, they're often gross as well, as well as unbelievable. You know, and then here, another thing that God ends up doing in the last um, couple of plagues for sure is just that difference between the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the Egyptians. He's making it blatant. I mean, if there's swarms of flies everywhere, and yet the Hebrews do not have flies where they're living, that seems to be an obvious of exactly what Moses had been saying. He is a God that we know.
Oh yeah,
You should know him also. And this one with the livestock,
yeah.
it's flat out just says it, you know.
Yeah, he makes it a point.
Yeah.
He makes it a point, and that I think that's where you were going, right? Where
Yes.
the livestock, and then the way the plague was sent,
Mm-hmm.
it was made very well known that it couldn't, because now you got everything that's gone on so far. These these magicians have tried to duplicate to be like, oh well, that's just smoke and mirrors. Oh, that's just a trick. The way God puts the fifth plague out and kills the livestock, he only did it for all the Egyptians.
Yep.
None of the livestock that belonged to the Israelites were affected at
Right.
all. So that it couldn't be explained or passed off as some natural phenomenon.
Right.
It couldn't be passed off as some widespread, oh, well, it could be anything. No, because it's only yours that are affected.
And yet, you know, that somehow they're like, well, I think the grass in our pastures was infected somehow, but the grass over there in Goshen, that wasn't infected. I mean, we've seen things that's blatantly God, and yet there are people, regardless of how absurd of an excuse they come up with, they will still come up with an excuse why there's some natural occurrence.
Well, and when I think of livestock, you know, I'm thinking of just, you know, the what am I trying to say? The average livestock, your cows, your bulls, your pigs, your goats, the things we see most often in our meat supply. But in verse 6 there, when it says the all, it means all in the field.
Yeah.
As in like all kinds of different animals. You got you know, the ram, the goat, the bull, all sacred animals in Egypt, and now they're just decomposing carcasses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's not only ruining their economy, their livestock, their food supply. It's completely like polluting their environment. When you think back from the dead fish to the river of blood now,
Yeah.
to dead frogs everywhere, gnats all over the place. Now you've got all these animals just rotting away.
Well, and mind you, as you mentioned earlier, just to reiterate, God gives them relief at the end of each one. The frogs go back into the river. The river does clean itself. It doesn't stay blood. The gnats, go away. The flies go away. So God gives relief from each one. He could have let it pile up on them. I say he gives relief. Mind you, the frogs just died. They didn't go away. So you
Right.
have to clean it up yourself. I'm guessing the same thing with the gnats and the flies. They just died and fell to the ground. So you got, in a house, you've got all kinds of nasty dead flies
Yeah.
everywhere that you got to get rid of.
I'm not
so
assuming they just disappear, though.
No, they-
I mean,
apparently they didn't, because with the frogs, he flat out tells us they just died. And they had piles of dead frogs everywhere to get rid of. So you got dead flies everywhere, dead gnats everywhere. It doesn't. I would guess the fish that died in the river, even though the river was no longer blood, they're still dead.
yeah, no, we see relief,
Yeah.
but we don't see the cleanup. We don't see it just disappear.
No.
And that's why I'm kind of going off of the assumption that's, maybe some of this stuff is piling up. But I know you're talking big livestock just
Yeah.
all over dead, rotting.
Hard to clean
And
that up.
it's hard to clean that up, and it's probably polluting more
Right.
than, the fish and the frogs.
Right. That's where
Although
diseases come
disgusting,
from.
yeah,
Rotting
exactly.
corpses.
I can just, man, I don't want to imagine it. I
Nope.
don't. Because, okay, we know there's 10. We know there's 10 plagues that take place here. I can't understand why after the first one,
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, my bad. I didn't take you seriously enough. Now I'm willing to do whatever you need me to do. And that would just be the seed planted. Okay, you made your point. Maybe I need to start rethinking what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But then again, I can't fully go in on that note because then again, I think back of all these different signs and things that I've been shown, and
Exactly.
still I was,
How many times
oh
were
yeah,
we?
I did good.
How many times were we called when we rejected that call?
Yeah,
And every time God called us, there was a knowing
yeah.
that we knew it was true,
Well, and that's
but
what
we rejected it.
I'm trying to. That's what I was trying to explain too, and not just in a sense of when I was a child, and I guess I was just a little reluctant to admit it, but I've done the same thing with God many a times. If you just do this one thing for me, I'll
Probably
continue.
more.
I'll do this. I'll do this. I'll do this,
Yeah.
and then after He does it, I'm like, oh, I did good.
Mm-hmm.
I did good. No. Maybe I'll go to church this Sunday, but maybe I won't. Maybe I won't. Maybe you know what? I'm tired.
Mm-hmm.
After getting that job I prayed for, it's my only day off, or
Yeah,
whatever the case is.
There's an important game on.
Yeah. So there was always something in the way that was like, you know what? Next week, God, next week I'll for sure do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm shocked and surprised when He sends the second plague.
And yet, right. It's funny. Like you're saying, it's the exact same thing because you're in deep trouble, right? And you're like, oh man, especially, as a kid, whatever it is that happened, or you broke a window or somehow messed up your neighbor's yard or the house or,
yeah,
something. And you're like, oh man, my parents are going to find out and this is going to be a disaster. And
just
I'm
get
going
me
to,
out of it this one time.
yeah, I'm not going to get any allowance for like 8 years because I'm going to have to pay for that. And then something will happen. Like, the neighbor's very forgiving and, he's able to file insurance, whatever,
Yeah.
however God gets you out of it, God got you out of it. And yet, because you have that relief from the punishment that you were scared of that didn't come, you forget God.
Yeah.
And we see Pharaoh play out that same scenario. It seems completely unbelievable because of how much bigger each one of these plagues are. But we've had plagues in our lives that God fixed for us when we begged Him to, and then we forgot Him as soon as they were fixed.
Well, and it just really doesn't help that He had so much influence. saying, "Oh, it's nothing more than a trick. Oh yeah, we can do it too." Oh, and they were doing it in an attempt to comfort Pharaoh.
But ours as well, right? And when God fixes things for us, it's rarely in a miraculous way, and yet we know God did it. It's always in some kind of way where, well, this person relented, or they were able to do this, or whatever it is.
Yeah, we
Or
try to
you
explain it.
just don't get busted like you should have
Yeah.
gotten busted, or someone just shows you mercy and you do get busted, but they say, you know what? We're going to let you off this time.
Well, yeah, I think we spend too much time also, same way Pharaoh was doing, trying to explain the way something happened, as opposed to, again, like you said, we know it was God, but then we're trying to explain how it happened as if we could justify how it turned, how it should have and did go into our favor.
Yeah.
But you can't explain all this with
Nope.
some logical sense when that's not how he brought it to you.
Right.
And we see it here. We see him do these or do these, bring these plagues in ways that you can't justify. You can't explain,
Nope.
even though we try to do it. And Pharaoh tried to do it too, even with the livestock, trying to say, "Oh, it's a natural disaster. It's happening to everybody," and it had to be made known. No, it is only happening to your livestock. It's not happening to the Israelites' livestock. It's happening to the Egyptians' livestock.
Right.
So explain to me what natural phenomenon this is when these two herds of livestock are side by side and theirs isn't affected. It had to be known. And I think in all things, God does these miracles, and even in our own lives today, that can't be explained for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Because all too often we try to justify and explain it with some natural
Yeah.
way of the world, or luck, or coincidence, or even I'll go as far as skill.
Yeah.
And we try to give ourselves the credit for it when we know that the way it panned out, the reason it can't be explained is because it was not something that I did. It wasn't something that we did. It wasn't something that man's hand did. It was what God did. And even though here they start to realize it, we're now in the fifth plague, and they started to realize it after the third plague that, hey, by the way, Pharaoh, we can't duplicate this one. What's going on here? And I like the way it's said too. the power. Let me go back. What did it say?
This is the finger of
Right.
God.
The power that a power greater than theirs was at work, as if their power was much at all.
Yeah.
Compared to what they're dealing with. Compared to what they're dealing with, they're dealing with God's hand. They're dealing with God's power. And it didn't take out of 10, but the first 3 for them to be like, "Whoa, this is too much for us. We need to go tell them that there's something bigger at hand, and that we can't keep going."
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It only took 3 for the magicians to say this is God. This is the finger of God.
Yeah.
And yet Pharaoh and his ego, Pharaoh and his desire to control this whole situation will not believe that it's more than just some natural occurrence that has caused this. And there are documentaries that are set to try to explain away all the miracles
Mm-hmm.
of the Bible itself, which again, I mean, that's just another step of why are you busy trying to explain away miracles and something that you clearly don't believe? It doesn't seem like it's a useful piece of your time, or something you claim you don't believe. I mean, why are you going to spend time trying to discredit something within something you don't believe?
Oh yeah.
All that just doesn't make sense to me. But
I think
in man's sinful condition,
uh-huh.
we will do almost anything to convince ourselves that there is not a holy God who is in control of everything. Regardless of how much we hear of his grace and mercy, we know he's holy and we know we're not.
Well, and I still can't explain this, but I don't know why, but it's a defense mechanism. It happens to make ourselves feel better. And we'll do it to try. It's a way of calming ourselves down as opposed to turning to the one that can give us the peace.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm eager. I am eager to see what comes of this. How many minds and hearts, if any, are changed after these 10 plagues. After it all takes place and relief between each one, and then finally at the end, I'm eager to see what takes place here with not only the Egyptians, but with Pharaoh. So join us next week. We got through the first 5. We're going to get through the next 5. We're going to get through the remaining 5 of these 10 plagues next week. We thank you for joining us, and God bless.